Alright, sounds good. Well, yeah, good evening everyone. As Professor Pearson mentioned, I'm Raul Duarte. Thank you for being here today. And I want to present my thesis that tried to study the socioeconomic determinants of poverty in Paraguay, where I'm originally from. I'm an international student from Paraguay. And I guess to start us off, it is relevant to mention that poverty is still a major issue in Paraguay. There has been some progress in poverty reduction, but still almost 25% of the population lives in poverty, and around 10% of the population is also in extreme poverty. And adding to this issue is the fact that Paraguay has one of the most unequal land distributions in Latin America. And this issue was made a little bit more prominent between the 1960s and 1990s, where an Institute for Agrarian Welfare was created, and around 10 million hectares of land were distributed, but around 8 million were not distributed to their intended beneficiaries, to say that in a light way. And I guess one fact also to illustrate how unequal land distribution is in Paraguay, we have that around 80% of agricultural lands in Paraguay are owned by 1.6% of landowners. And this is related to poverty, since Paraguay's economy is still quite dependent on agriculture. Over 20% of Paraguay's GDP is still provided by agriculture, and agriculture employs 1/3 of Paraguay's labor force as well. And this leads to Paraguay's economy being volatile in that sense, since it's dependent on weather and international commodity prices. So for example, in 2012, Paraguay had a drought in its southern region, which led to a bad soybean season, leading to an economic downturn and negative GDP growth rates. Even though just a year before, Paraguay had a GDP growth rate over 10%, so it leads to like this continuous process of booms and busts going back and forth. And next we have a graph showing the reduction in moderate poverty in Paraguay. So over this 10-year span that goes from 2003 to 2013, we notice a pattern that is prevalent in Paraguay, where the rural poverty rate is higher than the urban poverty rate, and also the urban poverty rate is almost stopped, like it's remained quite static. In the next year, it's just come out recently in the news just a couple of days ago, but for 2014 it was very similar. And so like the urban poverty rate has actually only slightly increased between 2012 and 2013 and between 2013 and 2014, but it's still decreasing in big amounts for the rural areas. And the moderate poverty line, I guess I should also explain that, is equivalent to the income that would allow one to purchase a basic basket of goods and services, such as like housing, clothing, food, and education. And next, I can also show the reduction in extreme poverty, and we notice a very similar pattern where the rural population is much more prone to be in poverty, and the urban poverty rate remains quite static. And to address my research questions, I guess first I should mention the limitations of my study. I'm using regression techniques, and the big limitation of regression techniques is that you can only find immediate or approximate causes of poverty, not exactly like the deep causes. So for example, my study finds that poverty is related to education, like poverty may be caused by a lack of education, but it doesn't allow me to say why some individuals lack education and why others have education in comparison. But this study still allows one to see, still provide some insights into which channels could be affecting poverty and like which variables could lead to further studies later on as well. And that is what I want to find out with my research. And so my specific research questions starting off my project were, which household characteristics and assets function as determinants of poverty? And this is more of asking like which are probable determinants of poverty, so because I can't establish causality right away. And also, what characteristics differentiate the poor and the non-poor? And that is something that I can definitely answer through my regressions and through my data. And I don't think I'll have time to address this, but then this will be much later on once causality is also established, what policy implications and recommendations can be derived from results like as this. And just to go over very briefly over my literature review, in 2001, Gonzalez did a study on regional income inequality in Paraguay, And one of the things he did was he ran a regression on finding employment in different regions. And this is an issue relevant to poverty, since an individual's income is mainly derived from their occupation. And some relevant variables he found were age, language, education, and access to infrastructure. And language is one of the key variables in my study as well, and that is something that I want to explain further. In Paraguay, we have 2 official languages, Spanish and Guarani. And even though you take both languages in your education from kindergarten to 12th grade, they're both the official languages. This study found, and other studies have found, that being only Guarani speaking is correlated with lower incomes and poverty status. And that is something that I wanted to study use in my study as well. And also my study takes much of its inspirations from the World Bank's 2010 poverty assessment of Paraguay. This was a very thorough study, but I was just focusing on its second chapter, in which they did a linear regression on household income per capita over different household characteristics. And some relevant variables the study found were age, household size, and different indicator variables like being only Guarani speaking, being male, among others. And also my study uses 3 different regression types. One is a linear regression on household per capita income, and I also run logistic regressions on poverty status. And my study looked at GETA study on Kenya and EPO study on Cameroon, which had logistic regressions as well. And to mention the specific contribution of my study is that it extends from the World Bank study, in the sense that I'm analyzing more recent data. The World Bank study used data from 2008, while my study uses data from 2013. And I also include new variables, including some indicator variables indicating informal employment, such as being self-employed, not having a work contract, being self-employed, being a family worker. Also spousal indicator variables for spousal education, access to services such as water and sewers, and some health-related variables as well, such as health insurance ownership and healthiness, healthiness is defined as, for my data source, it's being defined as not being sick in the last 6 months, where I take my data as from. And I also have logistic regressions on poverty status, which were not done before. And to talk a little bit more about my data, I'm using Paraguay's 2013 permanent survey of households. And this data set has a lot of different information on different household characteristics. Unfortunately, I can't run a panel since it takes a new sample every year, so I'm using a cross-sectional study on the most recent data available. And I have 5,424 households with observations, and as I mentioned before, my dependent variables are household per capita income, which is just household income divided by the number of household members, and poverty status. And I have 2 different logistic regressions. One is a binomial logistic regression, which has encoded my dependent variable as 0 for being in poverty and 1 for not being in poverty. Well, I also have a trichotomous variable which is encoded as the following: 3 for not being in poverty, 2 for being in moderate poverty, and 1 for being in extreme poverty. And next, to talk briefly about my variables. Also, my study wants to focus on specific key variables, which might be more exogenous and also might be related to policy implications later on as well, compared to some control variables that I also include in my study. So some of my key variables are education, gender. I specifically have an indicator variable for being male. Language, being only Guarani speaking. And a lot of these variables are specifically related to the household head, and in Paraguay, most of the families are still 1-income families. I also have land-owned, health, which are health insurance ownership and healthiness, access to services such as water, and electricity, and sewers, informal employment, and agriculture employment. And as my control variables, I have having the spouse present in the household, number of household members working, household size, and ownership of certain assets. And so for my results, just to go over them very briefly before I jump on them later on, my key variables correlate with poverty, where being only Guarani speaking, being a family worker, being self-employed in agricultural employment. While my key variables correlate with being out of poverty, or being male, secondary and tertiary education, specifically for the urban areas, health, access to sewers, and owning more than 15 hectares of land. And next, going over my descriptive statistics, I can already notice some key differences between the poor and the non-poor and see which characteristics differentiate both of these populations. So for my key household head variables, I can notice, for example, like a big difference between the poor and non-poor with regards to being only Guarani speaking, where the poor are much more prone to be only Guarani speaking compared to the non-poor, and it's where actually the poor are almost twice as prone as to speak only Guarani, for example. We can also notice a big difference in education, where the poor household heads on average have around 5 years of education compared to the non-poor, which have around 9 years. And this could be noticed also with the specific education levels, and this is especially prevalent with tertiary, where only around 1% of the poor household heads actually have a tertiary degree compared to 16% of the non-poor household heads. And we can also notice that the poor are much more prone to be employed in agriculture compared to the non-poor, and that they're more prone to be self-employed compared to the non-poor. And then with the health-related variables, the non-poor household heads are much more prone to have health insurance and have been healthy in the last 6 months of the survey as well. We can also notice some differences with the household themselves. So we can notice a similar difference in spousal education and also with access to services, where the non-poor households are much more likely to have access to water and access to sewers, especially access to sewers, where it's more than twice as probable for non-poor households. And we can also notice a difference in land. Next, to go to the crux of my study, the regressions. My study ran regressions on 3 different data sets: my overall data set, my urban data, and my rural data. But due to time constraints, I'll just go over my overall data set. And frankly, like my results were overwhelmingly similar for almost all areas, even though I expected different determinants and correlates for different areas. So I will go over like the main differences afterwards, but I'm showing the results for my general regressions. And I'm also showing my results for my key significant variables, since I had a lot of different variables, so I'm just going to focus on the key variables. And just to reiterate, my dependent variables for my linear regression were household per capita income, and for my logistic regressions, they were poverty status. So a positive coefficient would mean higher incomes and with my linear regression and not being in poverty for the logistic regression, while a negative coefficient would be correlated with lower incomes and being and poverty status. And also the asterisks, they might not be very noticeable, but 1 asterisk denotes significance at 10% level, 2 asterisks denote significance at the 5% level, and 3 asterisks denote significance at the 1% level. And so for my results, I find that being male is correlated with higher incomes and not being in poverty, and this has to be the channel with which this variable affects poverty has to be studied much further. The study does not say much in itself, but it could denote maybe some labor discrimination. It could denote different career choices between the genders, or other issues as well. Then we also find, and this correlates with other studies, that being only Guarani speaking is correlated with lower incomes and poverty status. And this could be due to the fact that a lot of occupations might require being bilingual, since Paraguay is a bilingual country, or also in urban areas, even though both languages are the official languages. In urban areas, Spanish is more prevalent, so being only Guarani speaking could put one at a disadvantage in the labor atmosphere in urban areas. And next we notice also that secondary is correlated with not being in poverty, and tertiary education is correlated with higher incomes. Same case for spousal tertiary education. And with agriculture, I had an interesting result. it was correlated with higher incomes, but it was correlated with poverty status. And even though it's not significant here, it is significant with my rural data where it would be most relevant. And the way this result could have occurred is the fact that some of my observations in my data had some observations of individuals working in agriculture, but they were quite wealthy. So these observations could have skewed my income data to have actually like a positive coefficient with linear incomes. But my logistic regressions on poverty status show the nonlinear effect of poverty and shows that working in agriculture is actually correlated with poverty status. And next we also have with the health-related variables that they correlate with higher incomes and not being in poverty. And one inexplicable result from my study, which I could not find a good reason why, was that access to water was correlated with lower incomes, and it was significant at the 5% level. Another interesting result was that access to sewers was correlated with higher incomes and not being in poverty. And granted, well, this could just be due to the fact of wealthy households living in areas which have access to sewers. This could also, since poverty does work in cycles, this could also be due to the fact that households living in areas which don't have access to sewers live in more unsanitary conditions, leading to health problems, which could lead to lower incomes and poverty status. Then we notice that my variable with the highest magnitude is owning more than 15 hectares of land, and it's correlated with higher incomes and not being in poverty. And I guess one thing I should be mentioned is that the Agrarian Institute in Paraguay considers 10 hectares to be the minimum for the basic subsistence of a 4-member family. And so this will make sense, and it would also mean that starting from like around 15 hectares of land, a family is better able to commercialize their products as well due to some economies of scale. And then we can also see that household size is correlated with lower incomes and poverty status, as would be expected, since my dependent variable was household per capita income, and number of household members working would counteract with this, with positive coefficients. Another interesting result was that not having a work contract was correlated with lower incomes, but it was correlated with being out of poverty. But this makes sense in the sense that not having a work contract denotes still being employed, which means having a means of subsistence, which could lift someone out of being in poverty. Yet, compared to those individuals employed that have a work contract, they would have lower incomes compared to those individuals. And finally, we find that being self-employed is correlated with lower incomes and being in poverty. And the only main differences with my rural and urban data were that with my urban data, I also found that being a family worker, as in working in a family business with an informal working contract, was significantly correlated with lower income and poverty status. And for my rural data, I found that secondary education had a significant negative coefficient, and that tertiary education had an insignificant coefficient. And this could be due to the fact that in rural areas, a lot of the occupations might still not require a lot of skills that could be acquired through formal education. Or it could also denote the fact that education in rural areas might not have a good marginal value still. And just to reiterate my main results, they were that my primary variables correlated with poverty were being only Guarani speaking, being a family worker were my urban data, self-employment, and agriculture employment, while my primary variables correlated with being out of poverty were being male, secondary and tertiary education with my general and urban data, health, access to sewers, and owning more than 15 hectares of land. And these results corroborate with the World Bank study. Many of the results are similar to what was found with the World Bank study. It also updated its results with some new variables such as self-employment, being a family worker, spousal education, which I had before, access to sewers, and the health-related variables. How am I doing on time? Good. I guess very, very briefly, I could go over some policy implications. And granted, these issues have to be analyzed much more further. Like I can't just derive policy recommendations from regression techniques. But some possible policy recommendations would be just a strengthening bilingual education programs, since both languages are still the official languages, but maybe just a matter of just improving education in both languages. Also just improving enrollment and completion of secondary and tertiary education programs. And this would just be an investment for the country as well. Maybe analyzing the possibility of an agrarian reform. This is a very convoluted issue, but it could be something that could be analyzed further. Otherwise, in the agricultural sector in Paraguay is known for having a very, very low tax burden, since agriculture contributes more than 20% of Paraguay's GDP, but it's for Paraguay's total tax revenues every year, agriculture accounts for less than 2%. So one possible solution could be just raising land taxes to an extent to help those in rural poverty and to lead to some poverty reduction policies. And other possible policy indications could be just improving health insurance provision and improving access to sewer systems. And finally, I just want to thank my advisor. Unfortunately couldn't make it today, but I really owe a lot of my progress due to Professor Yang Xiao Chin and also Professor Dorothy Peterson and Bruce Peterson for reading over every single one of my drafts. That was super helpful, and also to Dr. Bob Parks for seeing my methodology at the start just to make sure it was okay. And questions?
Questions for Raul?
Yes?
Given what you mentioned earlier that a previous agrarian reform had essentially served to redistribute land to
Yes.
politically connected individuals.
Exactly.
Do you think the government of Paraguay has the credibility to actually conduct poverty reducing reforms?
I think it's been getting better. There's a lot of corruption still in Paraguay, but if it's handed to the correct organization, or even to an international organization to take care of this, of an equitable agrarian reform, I think it could actually be a possible solution. But it's definitely something that has to be analyzed further, because agriculture does rely on economies of scale, and a lot of these landowners do derive a lot of their profit from these economies of scale, from owning large amounts of land, even though they may not acquire them legally at first, unfortunately. Yes?
So in the regressions, I noticed that the R-squared values look a little bit lowish, but I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think that's standard for literature, and also what do you think that would be? Do you think there's just a lot of noise in data? Do you think there are some variables that are important that you just didn't have data on? Or is this actually pretty standard for this type of literature, where you have R-squared data?
Well, from the World Bank study, it was similar R-squared,
Okay.
but then again, it could be other. I definitely don't have data on other variables, which would be quite a bit of interest as well. So I think it's both.
Sure.
Yes.
One of the things you would, I'm sure you know about, is the sort of comparative data here. Paraguay's been doing better than a lot of other countries. It's doing a lot better than Argentina, for example, right?
In some respects.
Well, I know it's a lower
Yeah.
base, but it's been growing better and more consistently. Isn't that right? It's much poorer earlier.
Yes, yeah, we have the fact that even though we have these busts, they're -1% or -2%, and then the next year we have over 10% of GDP growth rate. So in the end, it does balance out to higher growth in the end. True.
But I guess it's a prelude to the question. I mean, the way to get people less impoverished is to have higher growth rates, which may or may not increase the inequality in the process here. So that wasn't your project, but if you were looking at a way to reduce poverty, looking at the barriers to growth would be one of the...
Oh, definitely, yes.
So going back to the slides at the beginning, there seemed to be a sharp drop in rural poverty in the last couple of years, from two of the slides. And I was wondering whether that was a data issue, or that was real, you had a story for it, or...
Which one?
I'm talking about the graphs.
The graphs at the beginning.
At the very beginning of the talk.
Oh yeah, there's actually
It's pretty striking. Looks,
Yes.
if you just looked at rural, you go, hey, things looking kind of,
Yes,
promising.
actually, what happened was it was a combination of different factors, but one of the main factors was the extreme poverty line is derived from the food prices, and in the last 5 years, food prices have remained very, very stable, and this has led to and incomes have been increasing. So this combination of factors led to less individuals being in extreme poverty compared to than before.
You mentioned that the Paraguayan economy goes through booms and busts.
Yes.
What year was your cross-sectional data taken from, a boom or a bust? And do you think that affected
It was
the results?
It was a boom, but I guess comparatively, like the World Bank study was during a bust. It was during 2008. So we do find still consistency in the data.
Well.
Yes.
So you talked a little bit about policy implications, and that was more on a national level. I was just curious to hear if you were to go into a community and try to improve the economy on a local level, what do you think is the most important thing to implement?
In a Paraguayan community, or well, I guess like if we look at the magnitudes of some of the variables, it does seem that education is a very important variable, especially in urban areas. I guess like working with with individuals achieving like secondary and tertiary education for them to be later to be able to achieve like higher incomes, and I guess also if they're in rural areas, just trying to see if they can better commercialize their products in agriculture and seeing if you can improve like their way they go about producing their products as well. Yes?
Does Paraguay have a public or a private healthcare system?
It has a public system, but it's still it's not very efficient, to say the least.
Other questions? All very good questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.